Welcome to this explainer. Okay, let's dive into this, because today we are examining a truly eerie, deeply unsettling psychological phenomenon, the very last words spoken by inmates mere moments before their executions. We're going to take a highly analytical and frankly solemn look at the source material to decode these final messages left behind by some of history's absolute most notorious criminals. We'll see exactly what these parting words reveal about human psychology when someone is standing at the absolute edge of existence.
So, what exactly goes through the mind of a killer in those final, fleeting moments? I mean, when facing the ultimate penalty, do we actually witness a rare moment of clarity and genuine remorse? Or do these final statements reveal absolute, stubborn defiance, bizarre delusions, or just pure, calculated manipulation? Well, our source material pulls us straight into this very dark reality, breaking down these final words into distinct, fascinating psychological profiles.
Kiss my ass. Yep. Those were the stark, utterly remorseless final words spoken by John Wayne Gacy, notoriously known as the Killer Clown, right before his lethal injection on May 10, 1994. You know, there is absolutely no apology here, no reflection, just pure, unadulterated contempt for the world he was leaving behind. And this brilliantly illustrates the horrifying contrast between his arrogant final dismissal and the devastating reality of his crimes. 33. That is the staggering number of young men and boys that he murdered. He lured them in with promises of construction jobs, drugs, or even by flashing a fake police badge. And before burying them, he tortured them, chillingly telling his victims it was his last trick. His final words literally perfectly mirror the complete and total lack of empathy he showed them.
Section 1. Defiance and lack of remorse.
In this first psychological category, we're analyzing killers who use their final platform not to seek forgiveness, but to double down on their arrogant, remorseless worldviews. They wanted their last act on Earth to be a statement of total control. A prime example here is Timothy McVeigh. When it came time for his lethal injection on June 11, 2001, McVeigh stayed completely, totally silent. But he did leave behind a written message. "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." He lifted those final lines from the poem Invictus. It's just a staggering display of ego from a man responsible for such immense devastation.
And that ego is especially chilling when we actually face the devastating human cost. 168. The families of his victims understandably felt he got off far too easily, because this figure represents the 149 adults and 19 children he killed in the 1995 Oklahoma City Federal Building bombing. His final written statement was, at its core, a defiant refusal to acknowledge the true gravity of that horrifying number.
Next up, we transition to the infamous Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. His final words, as documented in our source, were a blunt, "Hail Satan." Now, what's kind of bizarre about Ramirez is that the self-proclaimed Satanist was actually sentenced to death, but he ended up dying of natural causes in 2013 before he could ever be executed. Still, his final statement remained entirely on brand with his dark, highly theatrical persona.
The sheer, terrifying scale of Ramirez's crimes throughout Los Angeles really speaks for itself. He invaded homes armed with machetes, knives, and hammers, showing absolutely zero discrimination. Seriously, his victims ranged in age from 6 all the way up to 83 years old. His final allegiance to darkness perfectly aligned with the completely indiscriminate terror he inflicted on the city back in 1984 and 1985.
Section 2. Manipulation until the end.
So instead of projecting defiance, some killers use a highly calculated mask. They feign normalcy, affection, or even righteousness right up to their very last breath, which leads us to a really disturbing question. Can we ever truly know what is in a psychopath's mind? The source material suggests that for these individuals, words aren't actually meant to convey truth. No, they are tools. Tools used for social manipulation to gain unwarranted sympathy or just to play a character, keeping their true, dark thoughts permanently hidden. Give my love to my family and friends. I mean, it sounds like the parting sentiment of just an ordinary loving person, right? But these surprisingly warm final words were actually spoken by Ted Bundy, right before he was sent to the electric chair on January 24, 1989. So the crucial point is how the word psychopath literally perfectly applies to Bundy. He is the subject of countless documentaries because he was an absolute master of social manipulation. That affectionate final facade heavily masked the horrific, violent acts he committed against more than 30 women in the 1970s. We will honestly probably never know what he was actually thinking at the very end.
We see this ultimate cognitive dissonance again with Wesley Allen Dodd. He claimed he found peace in the Lord right before choosing to be hanged on January 5, 1993. Yet, in grim reality, he'd openly confessed to thoroughly enjoying the horrific murders of 10-year-old William, 11-year-old Cole, and 4-year-old Lee in a Vancouver park. It is a terrifying masterclass in manipulative self-delusion, just completely hiding unparalleled depravity behind a veil of religious righteousness.
Section 3. The bizarre and delusional.
Now, in cases of profound madness, the final words completely detach from reality. These statements aren't necessarily calculated or defiant. They just reflect a mind utterly disconnected from our world. Get this. I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. This deeply strange, completely unrepentant, and frankly incomprehensible statement was delivered by Alien Wuornos, who robbed and shot more than 7 middle-aged men in Florida. She actually said this to the executioner and the audience before her lethal injection on October 9, 2002.
Let's move to and see how this builds by looking at the long timeline of Billy Wayne Coble. So Texas reinstated the death penalty in 1982. In 1989, Coble tied up his ex-wife and her daughters and murdered Robert, Zelda, and Bobby Vicha. He then sat on death row for literally decades until 2019, when he became the oldest man executed in Texas in a century.
And after all those decades, these were his actual final words. Coble inexplicably demanded $5 while addressing 5 family members directly. He said his "I love yous," demanded his $5 again, and simply said goodbye. He left the executioners and his own family completely puzzled about the true meaning of this bizarre transaction right before he died. Just wildly strange.
Section 4. The System and the Slogan.
Sometimes final words make much larger commentaries on the justice system itself. We start with the highly cynical final words of John Spenkelink: "Capital punishment means those without the capital get the punishment." Spenkelink was a drifter who claimed he actually killed his traveling companion in self-defense. But despite his long fight, he became the first person executed in Florida's electric chair on May 25, 1979, shortly after the Supreme Court reinstated the penalty. His words were a direct, pointed indictment of the very system killing him.
Now contrast Spankelink's deep cynicism with Robert Sullivan's quiet resignation. Sullivan spent over 10 years fighting his sentence for shooting Donald Schmidt twice in the head at a Howard Johnson restaurant. He even had the backing of Pope John Paul II. But before finally admitting defeat at the electric chair in 1983, he simply stated, "I hold no malice toward anyone, and may God bless us with his grace."
And then there is Gary Gilmore. He killed a Utah hotel manager and made history by becoming the first man executed by firing squad on January 17, 1977, right after the death penalty was reinstated. Facing down the rifles, Gilmore delivered these incredibly blunt, now famous 3 words: "Let's do it." Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the cultural ripple effect of those 3 words. Dan Whedon, a very famous advertising executive, actually credited Gary Gilmore's blunt final statement as the direct, surprising inspiration for Nike's massive, globally recognized brand slogan, "Just do it." Yeah, it is a shocking piece of trivia that bridges a cold-blooded killer's firing squad execution directly into modern pop culture. Pretty wild, right?
Section 5. The Ultimate Question. Having explored all these chilling psychological profiles, from the defiant and the manipulative to the totally bizarre and the cynical, we are left with a final, highly provocative thought. Does the punishment truly fit the crime? As the source material points out, while punishments obviously vary heavily by circumstance and jurisdiction, there is rarely universal agreement on what this ultimate penalty actually achieves. Do these final words offer us any real closure, or do they just leave us with more unsettling questions about the darkest corners of the human mind? Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.